I see Ronnie's there with his camera back on. So, I mean, Ronnie, you did greyhound campaigning for many years. So, what was the story with your experience?
Mainly, I mean, our campaign with regard to greyhound racing, I was involved with for 13 years. My wife Louise and I, we set up the first group in the UK to campaign against greyhound racing, which was called Greyhound Action. And it was mainly to do with holding protests outside tracks to educate people not to support greyhound racing, because most people going to greyhound racing weren't particularly, I wouldn't say they're cruel people, they were just people going for a night out. So it was a way of like removing economic support from an industry that was, to be quite honest, was already struggling. So it taking away a section of their support meant that quite a few of these tracks actually went under.
There's not many left now, is there, Ronnie?
No, I think there's been 3 closed in the last month, including Bellevue, which is a track in Manchester, which was probably the most popular track in the country. And it's I mean, it's at one time there were about 120 greyhound tracks operating in the country, and now there's probably only about 20 now, I'd say. It's really been reduced, and that was a kind of effective campaign in terms of identifying what was it that was keeping the industry alive, and actually putting pressure on that point.
Whilst you're on the thread of greyhound racing, I was actually wondering if anyone knew, why is it that greyhound racing is less popular than horse racing? Is it some sort of cultural speciesism that exploiting dogs for racing is somehow worse than horses? Or I'm just curious on that.
And perhaps classism factors in there too. Just because horse racing tends to be associated with kind of higher.
Is it not just because it's a smaller industry, full stop, or something like that?
It used to be more popular than horse racing at one time. It's been greyhound racing was very hard hit when in the UK anyway, when the betting laws were reformed. I think it was in the 60s, and people were allowed to go into betting shops on High Street, because prior to that, the only place they could bet was at the track. So people that wanted to gamble would have to go to greyhound racing. And greyhound racing was very popular because it took place a lot more frequently than horse racing. I mean, horse racing only takes place at each of the horse racing courses. It kind of only takes place, every couple of weeks or something like that, perhaps, or less than that. Whereas greyhound racing can take place 3 or 4 times a week at a dog track. And so it was a very frequent way that people, and this was kind of mostly men. People didn't go as families. It just men would go and stand in the cold and drink and smoke and gamble at these dog tracks. And it was very popular, and it was dealt a big blow when people were just allowed to go into a betting shop and place a bet. And that was kind of when the dog racing industry went into decline. And I think there's less money. I mean, it does rely that it was poorer people that went to the dog racing, and I think that's probably why. And it's a kind of different. The structure of it's different. It's more easy. It's easier to actually, I think, educate people not to support dog racing, because they kind of go to dog racing just for a night out, whereas with horse racing, people treat it kind of more as a kind of a bigger event, I think. And that's why, and there is more money in it. It is, the people involved in it are more wealthy, and so it's been able to survive better than dog racing.
Yeah, I always remember on British radio that even Radio 4 in the mornings, they would have a part of the sports thing. They would talk about which horses to bet on. They wouldn't do it with greyhounds and stuff.
Whilst people are doing that, I'll just quickly read out Declan's comment to do with the previous topic. he said it's easier to protest outside a greyhound track than a horse racing track because there are far more people attending horse race meetings, so protesters would be more likely to be attacked at the horse racing gatherings.
There was one where the National was closed down a few years ago, but I think groups like Animal Aid used to kind of leaflet around the Grand National, but it is true that you had to keep quite low key, and you needed kind of police protection. Really, it's not so much like that outside a greyhound track.
And it'd be difficult to get the data, but I'd love to know of the people attending either species being forced to race, how many people actually know that they're killed as a result. And especially when it comes to greyhounds, it's 10,000 in the UK, I believe, that quote unquote vanish each year throughout the whole process of the recruiting, as it were. So
the problem is, the main problem, and this is with horse racing as well as greyhound racing, is the greyhounds and horses that are killed before they even race, because about half of the number that are bred aren't suitable, and that's where the biggest death toll comes. People don't realise that, because there's a lot of talk about, especially with greyhounds, about greyhounds being rehomed after they come off the track. But the ones that actually get to race, in a sense, are the lucky ones, because they've survived the culling process of the young dogs. Exactly the same with horse racing. With horse racing, it's about 10,000. I think with greyhound racing, it may be less now, because the industry is so much smaller. So there is much less demand now for greyhounds to be bred, and so fewer end up being killed.
Yeah, and to Brad's point, I think just from a general outreach perspective, I found, it is a bit speciesist in and of itself, but almost tapping into, almost starting with horses and dogs and seeing what people's thoughts are around using them, and then building on to other species, I found is quite a good tactic. So especially here in Brighton, we have both in a short distance of us from where I do outreach. So it's quite a few miles away from here. Here's what happens. How do you feel about that?
Yeah,
so.
Because at one time in the animal rights movement, when we started Greyhound Action, which was in about 97, a lot of people in the animal rights movement said, well, why are you campaigning against that? That's just dogs running around the track and they enjoy it. And so why is it an issue? And we had to explain to people in the animal rights movement about what happened to the dogs, because there wasn't an awareness. There was no movement. In fact, the movement in the USA against greyhound racing started before the one in the UK, which is quite unusual, because most of the kind of animal rights stuff kind of seems to start in the UK first, but with greyhound racing it wasn't. The campaigns in the USA, and there's been a lot of success in the USA with closing tracks.
Did you say 1997, Ronnie?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
You're just lying, aren't you? Because we know the movement didn't exist until 2018.
Oh yes, that's right. Of course, yeah. I was lying.
Yeah.
I was lying. Yeah, and there was no animal liberation front or anything. That was all made up.